Their laughter echoed in the frigid air as my father shoved me forward. I stumbled, my bare feet scraping against the rough concrete of the porch. The door slammed behind me with a finality that sent a jolt of terror through my body. From the window, my mother's face appeared, framed in the warm glow of the house I had lived in my entire life. She smiled, her hand waving dismissively. "It's just a prank. You'll be fine." The cold bit into my skin instantly. I had no coat, no shoes, nothing but the thin pajamas I had been wearing before they had dragged me downstairs. The freezing wind sliced through the fabric like knives. I turned, pounding on the door with both fists. "Mom, Dad, let me in." Silence. My breath fogged in the air as I knocked again, harder. "Please. It's too cold. I'll get sick." I pressed my ear against the wood, straining to hear anything inside. The muffled sound of laughter filtered through, a cruel, detached amusement. Panic surged in my chest. This wasn't a joke. They weren't coming to let me back in. I pounded harder. "I'm sorry. Whatever I did, I'm sorry." My voice cracked. "Please don't leave me out here." No response. Tears blurred my vision, hot streaks against my frozen cheeks. My fingers burned from the cold, raw from slamming against the door, but I didn't stop. "Please. Mom. Dad." I screamed until my throat ached, my voice breaking into choked sobs. I couldn't believe this. My own parents, my family, had thrown me out like trash. I turned toward the window. My mother had disappeared from view. The curtains were drawn. The house was still and warm on the inside, as if I had never existed. The night stretched before me, endless and merciless. Snow flurries whipped through the air, dusting the ground. My breath hitched as I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to trap any remaining warmth. My feet were already numb, my toes tingling from the contact with the icy ground. I backed away from the door, shivering uncontrollably. Maybe if I waited a little longer, they'd let me back in. Maybe this was just some sick joke that would end soon. I curled up on the doorstep, pressing my knees to my chest. The cold crept into my bones, tightening its grip. Time dragged on. My teeth chattered violently. Every breath was a struggle against the icy air. They weren't coming. I forced myself to my feet, swaying as the frost gnawed at my skin. My breath came in short gasps, my body already weakening. I had to move. I had to find shelter. I took a step forward and nearly collapsed. My legs felt like lead, my muscles stiff. Each movement sent sharp stabs of pain through my frozen limbs. I glanced back at the house one last time. No lights flickered on. No door creaked open. No voice called my name. I was alone. A sob wrenched from my throat as I stumbled into the night, each step taking me further away from the place that had once been my home. The wind howled through the empty streets, a bitter reminder that I had nowhere to go. The night stretched on, cruel and unforgiving. I had walked until my legs gave out, until my feet were too numb to feel the jagged pavement beneath them. The cold had seeped into my bones, turning my limbs stiff and sluggish. I couldn't stop shaking, no matter how tightly I wrapped my arms around myself. I had no idea where to go. I had spent my entire life in that house. I had never needed to find shelter before, never worried about where my next meal would come from. Now, I was just another shadow in the dark, a nameless figure in the frozen streets. I barely remembered finding my way back to the house. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe I had just been walking in circles. Either way, I collapsed against the front door, my body too weak to hold itself up any longer. The wood was cold beneath my cheek, but at least it was something solid. My fingers twitched as I knocked weakly. "Please." My voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from hours of crying. "Nothing." I squeezed my eyes shut. Maybe they were asleep. Maybe if I just waited until morning, they'd open the door and laugh about how ridiculous this whole thing was. It was just a prank. That's what my mother had said, hadn't she? She had smiled when she said it. She had waved at me from the window, like this was all just some harmless joke. But it wasn't harmless. My teeth chattered so hard my jaw ached. I pressed my back against the door, curling into myself. My breath came out in shallow gasps, barely visible in the freezing air. Minutes dragged into hours. The cold wasn't sharp anymore. It had settled into something dull and heavy, a weight pressing down on my chest. My fingers felt strange, like they didn't belong to me anymore. I held them up in front of my face, but I could barely see them in the dim light of the street lamp. I knew I should move. I knew I should get up, find somewhere warmer. But my body refused to listen. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, deep and suffocating. My eyelids drooped. Maybe if I just closed my eyes for a little while, I'd feel better. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice whispered, "If you sleep, you won't wake up." My eyes snapped open. No, I couldn't sleep. I forced myself to sit up, groaning as my muscles protested. My stomach twisted painfully, a sharp cramp that made me double over. I pressed a hand to my abdomen, but it did nothing to ease the ache. Hunger. I had never really been hungry before. Not like this. Not the kind of hunger that gnawed at your insides, that made your limbs weak and your head swim. I needed food. I needed warmth. I needed to move. With a deep breath, I pushed myself up. My legs wobbled beneath me, but I stayed upright. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent. I turned away. The streets were empty, eerily quiet. Snowflakes drifted down lazily, melting as soon as they touched my skin. Streetlights cast long shadows, making everything feel even more unfamiliar. I walked, though I had no idea where I was going. Each step felt heavier than the last, my body screaming for rest. But I couldn't stop. I passed houses with glowing windows, families warm and safe inside. I could almost hear the muffled sound of laughter, of clinking dishes and quiet conversations. I wondered if my parents were still awake. If they were sitting in the living room, watching TV like nothing had happened. Did they even care that I was out here? I shook the thought away. Thinking about them wouldn't help me survive. I had to keep moving. By the time the sun began to rise, I was barely holding myself together. My lips were cracked and dry, my limbs stiff from the cold. I had never been so tired in my life. I found an alleyway between two buildings and sank down against the brick wall, tucking my knees to my chest. Just for a minute, I told myself. Just long enough to rest. The moment my eyes shut, I was gone. A sharp sound jerked me awake. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. My body screamed in protest, every muscle sore from sleeping on the hard ground. I blinked, trying to remember where I was. The alley. The cold. The hunger. It wasn't a dream. I wasn't home. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My stomach growled loudly, a painful reminder of how long it had been since I had eaten. I needed food. I pushed myself up, wincing as my joints popped. The sun was higher now, casting a weak light over the empty street. I had no money, no phone, no way to call for help. But I had to find something to eat. I wandered for what felt like hours. The cold wasn't as brutal now that the sun was up, but it was still there, clinging to my skin like a second layer. I passed a gas station and hesitated. Food. My stomach twisted painfully. I stepped closer, peering through the glass windows. Shelves stocked with chips, candy bars, bottled water. I needed it. But how? I pressed a hand against my empty pocket as if expecting money to magically appear. I had never stolen anything in my life. The thought made my skin crawl. But my hunger didn't care about right and wrong. I forced myself to walk inside. The warmth hit me instantly, making my frozen limbs tingle painfully. The cashier barely glanced at me, absorbed in his phone. I moved quickly, my hands shaking as I grabbed a small bag of chips and a bottle of water. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I turned toward the door. Hey. I froze. The cashier was watching me now, his eyes narrowed. You gonna pay for that? Panic surged through me. My mind screamed at me to run. I bolted. Shouts followed me as I sprinted out the door, my bare feet slamming against the pavement. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't stop. I ran until I couldn't anymore. Finally, I collapsed behind a dumpster, gasping for breath. My hands trembled as I tore open the bag of chips, shoving them into my mouth without thinking. They were stale. Salty. The best thing I had ever tasted. Tears stung my eyes as I gulped down the water. I had never thought about what it meant to be hungry. To be cold. to be alone. But now I knew. And no one was coming to save me. I woke up stiff and sore, my back pressed against the cold brick wall behind the dumpster. My stomach churned, though it wasn't from hunger this time. It was fear. The last 2 days had been a slow descent into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I had spent my first night outside my parents' doorstep, waiting for a kindness that never came. The second day, I had wandered the streets like a ghost, searching for help that never arrived. Now, I was just here. The streets weren't welcoming. They weren't warm or kind. They were brutal and uncaring, swallowing people whole and spitting them out as hollow shells of who they used to be. I wasn't hollow yet, but I could feel it creeping in, the numbness that came with being invisible. I shifted, wincing at the stiffness in my limbs. My body ached from the cold, my skin raw from sleeping on the hard ground. My fingers felt strange, like they weren't mine anymore, like the chill had claimed them as its own. I needed to move. The city around me was waking up, people emerging from their comfortable homes, stepping into cars, heading to jobs, to school, to normal lives. Lives I wasn't part of anymore. I pulled my knees to my chest, watching them, feeling something close to resentment curl in my stomach. Did they see me? Or was I already one of the forgotten? I forced myself to stand, every movement slow and painful. I had no destination, but I knew I couldn't stay in one place for too long. As I walked, I saw them, others like me. People huddled under blankets in doorways, leaning against buildings, clutching plastic bags filled with all they had left in the world. I wasn't the only one out here. I wasn't the first. I wouldn't be the last. But that didn't make it any easier. By midday, my stomach was screaming again. Hunger wasn't just an ache now, it was a living thing, gnawing at my insides, making me dizzy and weak. I needed food. The gas station incident had taught me one thing: I wasn't good at stealing. But what other option did I have? I wandered past a bakery, the smell of fresh bread making my stomach clench painfully. My eyes locked onto a display of pastries behind the glass, each one golden and soft, something I could almost taste just by looking at it. People walked in and out of the shop, chatting easily, laughing. None of them noticed me. I pressed my hands against the glass, watching as a worker inside filled a tray with leftover bread. Then, to my shock, she walked to the side door and set it outside in a crate. For people like me. I hesitated. Was this a trick? Some kind of cruel joke? I watched from a distance as another man, older, wearing layers of tattered clothing, approached the crate, took a roll, and stuffed it into his pocket. No one stopped him. I swallowed, my throat dry. I inched forward, my heart pounding. It felt wrong, somehow, to just take something without asking. But no one was stopping me. I reached into the crate, my fingers brushing against the rough crust of the bread. Warm. I grabbed it and backed away, half expecting someone to come running out and snatch it from me. But nothing happened. I bit into it so fast I barely tasted it. It was slightly stale, but it didn't matter. It was food. It was something to fill the empty space inside me. I ate too quickly, swallowing without chewing, barely registering the taste. When it was gone, I licked the crumbs from my fingers, desperate for every last bit. I wanted more. But I forced myself to walk away. I had survived another few hours. That was enough. For now. I spent the rest of the day wandering, looking for places where I wouldn't be noticed. I needed to find somewhere to sleep before night fell again. The alleyways were dangerous. I had learned that already. There were people there who looked at me too long, their eyes dark with something I didn't understand. People who whispered to each other when they saw me. I kept moving. I passed a park and hesitated. It was empty now, the benches wet from the morning dew. But there was a gazebo near the center, partially sheltered. It wasn't much, but it was something. I hurried toward it, curling up beneath the wooden beams, pulling my knees to my chest. I wasn't warm. I wasn't safe. But at least I was hidden. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cold returned, sharper than before. It sank into my bones, wrapping around me like a second skin. I tried to sleep, tried to ignore the hunger, the fear, the loneliness. But I couldn't forget the way my mother had smiled when she locked the door. The way my father had laughed as he pushed me into the night. They weren't coming back for me. They had left me to die. And I wasn't going to let them win. The next morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps. My body tensed. I didn't move, barely even breathed. A shadow loomed over me. You knew. The voice was rough, scratchy. A man. I cracked my eyes open, my heart hammering. An old man stood above me, his face weathered, his beard patchy and gray. His clothes were layered, tattered, but his eyes weren't cruel. I didn't answer. He sighed and sat down on the opposite side of the gazebo, pulling something from his pocket. A piece of bread, already half-eaten. You look like hell, he muttered, tearing a chunk off and tossing it toward me. I stared at it. Go on, he said. It ain't poison. I hesitated, then snatched it up, shoving it into my mouth. He chuckled. Yeah, thought so. I swallowed hard. Who are you? Call me Grady. He leaned back against the gazebo post, squinting at me. You're young. Too young to be out here. I didn't answer. Parents? He asked. I looked away. He sighed again. Figured. Don't worry. Ain't gonna ask. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he shifted. You wanna survive out here, kid? You gotta learn the rules. I frowned. Rules? Grady nodded. Rule number 1. Don't trust nobody. Not even me. I stiffened. Rule number 2, he continued. Never sleep in the same place 2 nights in a row. Makes you an easy target. I swallowed. And rule number 3? He smirked. Rule number 3, if you want to live, you better learn how to fight back. I stared at him, my hands curling into fists. I wasn't just going to survive. I was going to make them regret ever leaving me to die. Grady wasn't lying when he said the streets had rules. He taught me that on my first full day as one of them, the forgotten, the abandoned, the invisible. I followed him cautiously, my body still weak, my mind screaming not to trust him. But the truth was, I didn't have a choice. I needed to learn how to survive. And he knew how. This ain't a life for the weak, he told me as we wove through the alleys. People see you're young, they'll take advantage. You keep your head down, you move fast, and you don't owe nobody anything. Got it? I nodded, even though my throat felt tight. That first week, I learned to move through the city without being noticed. Grady showed me how to scavenge for food. Dumpsters behind restaurants were gold mines just before closing time. Grocery stores sometimes threw out perfectly good produce. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me from starving. Better to take from the trash than from a man's pocket, he warned. You steal from people, you make enemies. And out here, enemies kill. I listened. I learned. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the cold. Winter settled over the city like a curse, tightening its grip with every passing night. The wind was sharp enough to cut through layers of clothes I didn't have. I lost feeling in my fingers more times than I could count. Some mornings, I woke up unable to move, my body stiff with frost. One night, the fever came. It started as a headache, dull and constant, gnawing at the edges of my mind. By morning, my entire body ached. My skin burned, but I couldn't get warm. The city spun around me when I walked, and my stomach churned, rejecting even the smallest scraps of food. Grady noticed before I did. You're burning up, kid, he muttered, pressing a rough hand to my forehead. Damn it. You'll die out here like this. I barely heard him. The world was slipping in and out of focus. I don't remember how he got me to the shelter. I do remember the bright lights, the warmth that wrapped around me like a blanket, the distant sound of voices arguing. She needs a hospital, someone said. No money, Grady's voice answered. She stays here. Drifted in and out of fever dreams. My parents' laughter echoed in my head. Their faces blurred together in the darkness, shifting between smiles and sneers. Let's see how long she lasts. Days passed. Maybe weeks. I wasn't sure. When I woke up for good, Grady was there. He looked tired, older than before. But there was relief in his eyes. Tougher than you look, kid, he muttered. I wanted to thank him. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sat up, swallowed the nausea, and decided I wouldn't let myself get that weak again. After that, survival became my only focus. The sickness had nearly killed me. I wouldn't let it happen twice. I found an old jacket someone had left behind in the shelter. It was too big, the sleeves swallowing my hands, but it was warm. A week later, I found a pair of shoes in a donation box. They were scuffed, the soles worn thin, but they were better than bare feet on frozen pavement. Grady kept teaching me the rules. Always watch your back. Never take more than you need. Greed gets people killed. Find a spot to sleep before sundown, but never get comfortable. Some nights, we stayed near the shelters, blending in with the others who had nowhere else to go. Other nights, we found places to hide, abandoned buildings, stairwells, the occasional unlocked storage unit. But the nights weren't the worst part. The worst part was the hunger. No matter how much I ate, it was never enough. My stomach was a hollow pit, twisting and growling, making my head spin when I walked too long without food. I started stealing. At first, it was small things: a roll from a bakery, an apple from a street vendor. My hands shook every time, my heart racing as I stuffed food into my pockets. Then I got better at it. Faster. I stopped hesitating. Because hesitation meant hunger. And hunger meant weakness. One night I saw her. My mother. She was walking out of a high-end restaurant, wrapped in a fur-lined coat, laughing at something my father had said. He held the door open for her, his watch glinting under the streetlights. My breath caught in my throat. They looked the same. Like nothing had changed. Like I hadn't existed at all. I stood there, frozen, my body stiff with cold and fury, watching as they got into their sleek black car and drove away. They didn't see me. They didn't look. They weren't wondering where I was. They weren't missing me. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. They had left me to die. And they didn't even care. That night, I couldn't sleep. The hunger wasn't just in my stomach anymore. It was in my bones, in my mind, in the very air I breathed. It wasn't hunger for food. It was hunger for something else. Something sharper. Something that burned. I wanted them to feel what I had felt. I wanted them to know what it was like to be cold, alone, starving. I wanted them to suffer. Grady must have seen it in my face the next morning. "Careful, kid," he said, tossing me half a sandwich he had found. Revenge ain't worth dying for. I met his gaze, swallowing the stale bread without tasting it. "Neither is forgiveness," I muttered. Grady let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You got that look in your eyes." "What look?" "The kind that gets people killed." I didn't answer. Because I wasn't planning on dying. I was planning on surviving. And one day, when the time was right, I was going to make them regret every second of what they had done. The day I left the streets behind, I felt nothing. No regret. No sadness. No fear. Only purpose. Grady had always told me, if you want to get out, you gotta play the game better than the ones who put you down. I had taken those words to heart. Every step I had taken since that first night in the cold was a calculated move, a slow climb from nothing to something. I was 17 when I got my first real job. Nothing glamorous. Just sweeping floors in a diner, scrubbing grease off countertops, taking out trash that smelled like spoiled meat and stale coffee. It paid next to nothing. But it was a start. For the first time in years, I had money of my own. Not much, but enough to buy food that wasn't stolen. Enough to sleep somewhere that wasn't a frozen alley or a shelter filled with desperate eyes and empty stomachs. I worked harder than anyone. The manager took notice. "You looking for more hours?" he asked one day, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yes." "Good. You don't complain like the others. Let's see how you handle the register." That's how it started. One job became 2. Then 3. I worked the diner in the mornings, stocked shelves at a convenience store in the afternoons, cleaned offices at night. My body ached, my feet throbbed, my hands cracked from scrubbing floors with cheap chemicals. But I didn't stop. Because the pain of working was nothing compared to the pain of starving. Money was a strange thing. When you had none, it ruled your life. Every thought, every decision, every desperate act revolved around getting just enough to survive. But when you had even a little, you started to see the world differently. I stopped looking for the next meal and started looking for the next opportunity. I saved every dollar, every cent. While the others at the diner spent their paychecks on cigarettes and beer, I stuffed mine into an old shoebox under my bed in the tiny room I rented. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Then one night, I was cleaning an office when I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two men in suits, talking about investments, stocks, business. I didn't understand most of it, but I caught two words that stuck in my mind: smart money. I went home that night and borrowed an old laptop from a neighbor. Spent hours searching, reading, trying to understand how money worked, how people made it, how they kept it. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I took my entire savings, just over $2,000, and made my first investment. It wasn't luck. It was research. Calculated risk. I watched every move of the market like a predator tracking prey. Learned when to pull out, when to hold, when to walk away, and when to strike. My 2,000 doubled, then tripled. By 19, I had 10 grand. By 20, I had 50. I walked away from the diner, then the convenience store, then the office cleaning job. I had money, real money, enough to rent my own place, a tiny apartment with a broken heater and leaky pipes. But it was mine, enough to buy clothes that fit, shoes that didn't have holes in the soles, food that didn't come from a dumpster. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was winning. But winning wasn't enough. I wanted more. I started learning about business, about power. The kind of power that made people sit up and listen. The kind that made the ones who had laughed at you suddenly want to shake your hand. I studied how companies grew, how people built empires from nothing. I took every dollar I had and threw it into building something bigger. A business. Then another. By 22, I was making more money than I had ever seen in my life. By 25, I was a name. Not famous. Not yet. But known. The girl who came from nothing. The girl who turned survival into strategy. I had played the game. And I had won. One night, I stood in the lobby of my office building, mine, watching as people in suits rushed past me. People who had no idea where I had come from, what I had been through. Grady's words echoed in my head. If you want to get out, you gotta play the game better than the ones who put you down. I had done that. And more. But something was still missing. Something unfinished. Something that had been burning in my chest since the night my parents left me to die. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, stopped at one name. A name I hadn't thought about in years. Not because I had forgotten. Because I had been waiting for the right time. I pressed call. The line rang. Once. Twice. Then a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade. Hello? I smiled. Mom, I said. It's been a long time. I sat in my office, my fingers tapping slowly against the desk as I listened to the silence on the other end of the phone. It had been years since I last heard her voice. Years since I had even let myself say the word mom out loud. And now, here she was, breathing on the other end of the line. Mom, I repeated, dragging the word out, testing it, tasting it like something foreign. There was a long pause. Then, finally, she spoke. Who is this? A sharp, bitter laugh rose in my throat. Of course, she didn't recognize me. Why would she? I wasn't the shivering girl she had tossed out into the cold. I wasn't the starving, broken child pounding on the door, begging to be let back in. I had changed. I had built myself into something she wouldn't even be able to comprehend. But I hadn't forgotten. I leaned back in my chair, letting my voice drop into something calm, controlled. Come on, Mom. Don't tell me you've already forgotten about me. Your own daughter. Silence. Then, a sharp intake of breath. It can't be. I could hear it in her voice, hesitation, panic, maybe even guilt. Good. It is, I said smoothly. It's been a long time, hasn't it? Another pause. Then a soft, forced laugh. Well, this is a surprise. I could practically hear her scrambling to collect herself, to find the right words to say. I imagined her standing in whatever house she had now, clutching the phone with shaking hands. But she had no idea why I was calling. Not yet. How have you been, Mom? I asked, keeping my voice light, pleasant, as if we were just catching up after all these years. She hesitated. Oh, things have been hard. I smirked. Hard? Yes, she sighed, her voice shifting into something pitiful. Your father and I, well, we've had some struggles. Business hasn't been great, and… Business, I repeated. Right. The company. I already knew everything. I had been watching them for months. The company my father had once ruled with an iron grip? Gone. The wealth they had clung to? Vanished. Their business had collapsed under its own weight, drowning in debts and lawsuits. They had lost their home, the same home that once locked me out in the cold. And now they had nothing. I could feel my mother waiting, holding her breath, wondering what I would say next. So I let her wait. Finally, she spoke again, her voice carefully measured. You've done well for yourself, haven't you? I smiled. She was fishing, trying to confirm what she already suspected. I have, I said simply. More than well. Oh, she breathed. That's wonderful. I could hear the gears turning in her mind. She had abandoned me, left me to starve. But now? Now, she needed me. It was pathetic. And I was going to make sure she knew it. So, I said casually, tell me, Mom, how bad is it? She hesitated again. Well, we've had some financial troubles. Just temporary, of course. But you know how things are. A little bit of help could go a long way. There it was. The begging. I tilted my head back, staring at the ceiling as satisfaction curled in my chest. You're struggling, I said, feigning concern. Yes. Her voice wavered. We lost the house. I closed my eyes and let the words wash over me. The house where I had pounded on the door, screaming for them to let me back in. The house where I had curled up on the doorstep, waiting for kindness that never came. The house that had once been my prison. Gone. I let out a slow breath. That's a shame. It is, she sighed dramatically. Your father and I, we just don't know what to do. It's been so hard on us. I let the silence stretch, let her feel the weight of it. Then I spoke. And you thought of me. Well, she trailed off. You're our daughter. I almost laughed. Now I was their daughter? When they threw me out like trash, I hadn't been. When they ignored my cries, I hadn't been. But now, when they needed something, suddenly I was family. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my desk. What exactly are you asking for, Mom? She hesitated again. We need a place to stay. Just for a little while. Until we get back on our feet. A place to stay. My grip tightened around the phone. They wanted my help. They wanted me to save them. Oh, how the tables had turned. I inhaled slowly, letting the moment settle deep into my bones. Then, finally, I spoke. I said softly, I remember the last time someone needed a place to stay. A warm bed. Shelter from the cold. The line went silent. I smiled. And do you remember what happened? Sweetheart, that was so long ago. They were left outside, I continued, my voice calm, measured. Alone. No coat. No food. No way back in. A choked sound came through the phone. I imagined her sitting there, gripping the receiver, her heart pounding. I wanted her to feel it. The fear. The helplessness. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the city skyline. Tell me, Mom, I murmured. How long do you think you'll last? She let out a broken breath. Please, we have nowhere else to go. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control. Real control. And I wasn't done yet. I let the silence hang heavy between us, let her suffer in it. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I exhaled. All right, I said. Come find me. Her breath hitched. You mean it? I smiled, though she couldn't see it. Of course. I'd never abandoned my family. She made a sound, half relief, half disbelief. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you, sweetheart. You don't know what this means to us. Oh, but I did. And soon, she would too. Because this wasn't forgiveness. This was the beginning of payback. The day I had been waiting for had finally come. After years of scraping, clawing, and climbing, I had built myself into something they never could have imagined. I was no longer the shivering, broken girl they had left to die. I was someone they needed now. Someone they had to beg. And that was exactly what they were doing. I watched the phone screen light up again. My mother's name. The same woman who had waved at me from the window as I pounded on the door, begging to be let in. Now, she was the one calling me. I let it ring a few more times before I answered, keeping my voice smooth, calm. Hello? A shaky breath. Sweetheart, she exhaled. It's so good to hear your voice again, sweetheart. As if the word meant anything now. I leaned back in my chair, gazing out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office. The city stretched out below me, a kingdom I had built from nothing. I got your message, I said, keeping my tone neutral. You need help. A pause. Yes, she admitted. Your father and we lost everything. Her voice cracked. The house, the business, the bank took it all. I already knew this. I had made sure of it. For months, I had been watching them crumble, keeping tabs as their empire fell apart. Their debts had piled up. Their investments had failed. Every safety net they thought they had been ripped away. And now, with nowhere else to turn, they had come to me. I could hear the desperation in her voice, the way she was holding back tears. The same way I had, all those years ago, when I had begged them to let me back inside. A sharp pang of satisfaction curled in my chest. I see, I said slowly. We have nowhere to go, she continued, her voice trembling. We tried everything, but no one will help us. We don't have anyone else. No one else. I had once believed the same thing, standing outside in the cold, abandoned by the only people I had ever known. Now it was their turn. What about your friends? I asked. The people you used to do business with? She let out a hollow laugh, brittle and weak. They turned their backs on us the moment the money was gone. I smiled to myself. Of course they did. I let the silence stretch between us, let her feel the weight of it. Finally, she broke. Please, she whispered. We need you. There it was. The begging. The pleading. The sound of a woman realizing she was at the mercy of the very person she had once left to die. I had imagined this moment for years. Dreamed about it. Craved it. But now that it was here, I wasn't satisfied yet. Not enough. Not nearly enough. I let out a slow, thoughtful hum. You need me, I repeated, savoring the words. That's interesting. She hesitated. I know we made mistakes. Mistakes. That's what she was calling it. Not abandonment. Not betrayal. Just mistakes. I clenched my jaw, but kept my voice even. Tell me, Mom, I said, tilting my head. What exactly do you need? Another pause. She knew she was walking on thin ice now. Just a place to stay, she said softly. Until we can figure things out. A place to stay. Yes, she said, a little too quickly. We won't be a burden. We just need somewhere warm, somewhere safe. Warm. Safe. The irony nearly made me laugh. They had never cared about warmth or safety when they shoved me outside. I closed my eyes, inhaling slowly. And what about Dad? I asked. He's okay with this? Coming to me for help. A sharp breath. He doesn't know I'm calling. My eyebrows lifted. Really? She exhaled shakily. He's too proud. But he'll come around. I let out a quiet chuckle. Of course he will. She heard the edge in my voice, the hint of something she couldn't quite place. Sweetheart, she asked cautiously. Are you okay? I smiled. Oh, now she wanted to ask if I was okay? I'm fine, Mom, I said smoothly. Just thinking about what? I let the silence stretch, keeping her on edge, letting her wait for my answer. Finally, I spoke. I remember when I was in your position, I said. Cold, hungry, desperate. She didn't respond. And I remember what you said to me. Still silence. I leaned forward slightly, my fingers curling around the edge of my desk. You told me it was just a prank. She let out a shaky breath. That was. I cut her off. Do you remember how long I lasted, Mom? She didn't answer. I tilted my head. Go on. Guess. I don't. 2 years. Her breath hitched. That's how long I lasted before I stopped being the girl you threw away. My voice was soft, almost gentle. Before I stopped begging. She was trembling now, I could hear it. Sweetheart. You never looked for me, I said. Never checked if I was alive. Never cared. She let out a broken sound. And now, I murmured, you're calling me, asking me to save you. Silence. I let out a quiet chuckle. Tell me, Mom, how does it feel? A choke sob. I smiled. Good. I wanted her to feel it, to understand. I took a slow breath, exhaling through my nose. I'll send you an address, I said. A startled gasp. You and Dad can come tomorrow, I continued smoothly. I'll be waiting. Sweetheart, thank you, she whispered, voice thick with relief. I don't know how to. I hung up. I leaned back in my chair, staring at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. This wasn't over. Not yet. Because when they arrived at my gates tomorrow, that's when the real fun would begin. The next day arrived with a biting chill in the air. The sky was overcast, gray clouds stretching endlessly, suffocating the light. It was the kind of cold that seeped into the bones, that made people huddle into themselves, desperate for warmth. Perfect. I sat in my study, sipping coffee from an expensive porcelain cup, watching the security cameras feed live footage of the front gates. The long, winding driveway leading up to my estate was empty for now. But they would be here soon. They had nowhere else to go. I leaned back in my chair, letting the anticipation settle over me like a thick, comforting blanket. For years, I had dreamed about this moment. Not in a fleeting, abstract way, but in vivid, painstaking detail. I had imagined every possible scenario, every word they would say, every expression that would cross their faces when they realized exactly who held the power now. I had waited for this. And today, it was finally happening. The intercom buzzed, a sharp sound that cut through the silence of the house. I didn't move right away. I let it buzz again. And again. Then, I pressed the button. Yes! A familiar, trembling voice came through. Sweetheart, we're here. I could hear the exhaustion in her words, the desperation wrapped around the edges of her voice. I could picture them standing there, shivering in the cold. Their expensive clothes worn thin, their dignity stripped away. I switched the security feed to the front gate camera. There they were. My mother stood slightly hunched, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to fight off the chill. Her once perfectly styled hair was now dull and lifeless, her skin pale and drawn. And beside her stood my father, the man who had shoved me out into the cold and left. He looked different now. His suit, though still well-tailored, was no longer crisp and commanding. It looked like it had been worn one too many times without being cleaned. His eyes, once sharp and filled with arrogance, now held something else. Something unfamiliar. Defeat. I leaned closer to the screen, savoring the sight. This was better than I had imagined. I pressed the intercom again. What do you want? My mother looked up at the camera, blinking rapidly. Sweetheart, please, can you open the gates? It's freezing out here. I hummed, pretending to think. I don't know, should I? She stiffened, glancing at my father. He had his jaw clenched, his eyes trained on the camera, but he said nothing. I wasn't surprised. His pride must have been a dagger in his throat. Please, she tried again. Just let us inside. We just need to talk. I let the silence stretch. Let them squirm. Then, slowly, I pressed the button that unlocked the gates. The heavy iron bars groaned as they slid open, revealing the long path leading up to the estate. My mother let out a shaky breath of relief, grabbing my father's arm as they stepped forward. I watched them walk. Step by step, moving up the driveway like beggars approaching a palace. The power shift was palpable. By the time they reached the grand front doors, I was waiting. I opened them slowly, just enough for them to see me standing there, framed by the warmth of the house behind me. My mother's breath hitched. Oh, sweetheart. I held up a hand. Not yet. She faltered, her lips pressing together. I turned my gaze to my father. Well? He met my stare, his jaw working, his fists tightening at his sides. I raised a brow. Nothing to say? He exhaled sharply, looking away. I stepped forward, just enough to let the cold bite at my skin. I seem to remember the last time we were in this position, I mused. Except, back then, I was the one outside. My mother flinched. Sweetheart, we don't. My voice was sharp, cutting through the air like ice. Don't call me that. Her face crumpled. I took my time, studying them. They looked small. Nothing like the people who had once loomed over me, holding my life in their hands. I tilted my head. How does it feel? My mother swallowed hard. What? I stepped forward again, letting them feel the weight of my presence. To be the ones on the other side of the door. My father's face hardened. This isn't the same. I laughed, slow and deliberate. Isn't it? We were trying to teach you something, he said, his voice tight. Oh, you taught me plenty. I met his gaze head-on. You taught me that family means nothing. That the only person I could ever rely on was myself. That kindness is weakness. And that mercy? I let a slow smile spread across my lips. Mercy is for people who deserve it. My mother let out a quiet sob. We were wrong. Yes, I said simply. You were. She took a step closer. Please. We don't have anywhere else to go. I inhaled deeply, pretending to consider. Nowhere else. She shook her head. I let out a long sigh, then reached for the intercom beside the door. I pressed a button, and the security feed flickered onto a large screen behind me. It showed the front gates. Still open. I leaned in, my voice soft, almost mocking. Then I guess you should have thought about that before you threw me away. Their eyes widened. And then I pressed another button. The gates groaned again. And then they closed. My mother let out a gasp. No. I turned my gaze to my father. How long do you think you'll last? Panic flickered across his face. You wouldn't. Wouldn't I? He clenched his fists. We're your parents. I smiled. Not anymore. My mother sobbed, reaching for me, but I stepped back. I watched as realization dawned on their faces. They weren't coming inside. They weren't welcome. This time, they were the ones left outside. And I wasn't letting them back in. I met their wide, desperate eyes one last time. Then, slowly, I shut the door. And locked it. The door clicked shut with a quiet finality. The lock slid into place, a small sound, but one that echoed in the vast, silent halls of my estate. I stood there for a moment, my fingers still resting on the handle, my heart a steady, deliberate beat in my chest. They were outside now, in the cold, just like I had been. I turned, making my way to the security panel on the wall, pressing a button that brought the live feed back onto the screen. There they were. My mother was trembling, hugging herself as if she could fight off the biting wind. My father stood stiff, his face pale with a mixture of fury and disbelief. They hadn't moved. They were still processing it. The reality. The fact that I had done to them what they had once done to me. The poetic symmetry of it was delicious. I reached for the intercom, pressing the button that connected my voice directly to the speakers outside. Mom, I said, my voice calm, almost amused. She flinched at the sound of my voice. Please, she gasped, her breath fogging in the air. Please, don't do this. I tilted my head, pretending to think. Do what? She let out a shaky sob. Don't leave us out here. It's freezing. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. Oh, it is, I said lightly. I wouldn't know. It's warm in here. I watched as my father's jaw clenched, his pride warring with his desperation. He was struggling to hold on to the last shreds of his dignity, but I could see it in his posture. He was crumbling. Good. I shifted, making my voice softer, more thoughtful. You know, I remember being cold once. Very cold. I remember knocking on a door, begging to be let inside. My mother sobbed. And do you remember what you said to me, Mom? She covered her mouth, shaking her head as tears streamed down her face. I didn't wait for her answer. I already knew it. I leaned in closer to the intercom, my voice dropping to a whisper. It's just a prank. A sharp, horrified gasp tore from her throat. I saw it in her face. The moment it truly hit her. The realization that this wasn't just revenge. This was justice. This was the price for every night I had spent starving, every winter I had survived alone, every moment I had been invisible to the world. They had thrown me away. Now, they were the ones discarded. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. "Tell me," I said, "how does it feel?" My father's lips parted, but no words came out. He looked at me through the camera, his eyes no longer filled with arrogance. No longer filled with power. There was only fear. I had waited years for that look. I let the silence stretch between us, thick and suffocating. Then, finally, my father spoke. "Please," he said, voice hoarse. We have nowhere else to go." I felt nothing. No pity. No guilt. Only satisfaction. I exhaled through my nose, shaking my head. "Neither did I said simply. My mother clutched my father's arm, sobbing into his shoulder. I watched. I let them feel it. I let them understand. Then, I pressed another button on the intercom. Click. The connection cut off. Outside, my mother cried harder. My father turned away from the camera, running a shaking hand down his face. I stood, smoothing down my silk blouse, feeling the warmth of the room wrap around me like a second skin. I had won. This was the moment I had spent years waiting for. And yet, something gnawed at the edges of my mind. A whisper, quiet but persistent. I frowned. This wasn't enough. Not yet. I turned back to the screen, watching as my parents stumbled toward the gate, trying to push it open. It wouldn't budge. The security system was flawless. They weren't going anywhere. And I wasn't finished yet. I stepped away from my desk, walking to the front window. I could see them from here, small and desperate against the vastness of my estate. Pathetic. I lifted my phone, pressing a number. The call rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Yes, miss." "Turn on the sprinklers," I said coolly. A pause. Then, understood. I hung up. And a moment later, a sharp hiss filled the air. The sprinklers burst to life, drenching my parents in freezing water. My mother shrieked, scrambling backward, slipping on the wet pavement. My father cursed, trying to shield himself from the icy spray. I watched from the window, sipping my coffee as they sputtered and gasped, their clothes clinging to their bodies, their breath coming in frantic puffs of steam. I had spent so many nights like that. So many nights shivering, soaked, teeth chattering uncontrollably. Now, they would know what it felt like. Now, they would remember. I gave them 5 minutes. Then, I turned off the water. I pressed the intercom again. Still out there. My mother's teeth chattered. "PL, please, we will do anything." I smirked. "Anything?" She nodded desperately. I let out a quiet chuckle. "Interesting." Then, I pressed another button. The gates groaned and unlocked. They didn't hesitate. They pushed through, running toward the warmth of my house like rats scurrying for shelter. I waited until they reached the front steps. Then, just as my mother lifted her shaking hand to knock, I pressed the button again. The gates slammed shut. She whirled around, eyes wild. "No, no, please." I tilted my head, watching from the window. Then, in the coldest, most deliberate voice I had ever used, I said, "That was just a prank." Her face collapsed. My father let out a strangled sound, falling to his knees. I stood there, watching as they finally broke. As they finally understood. And as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall around them, I turned off the security feed. And walked away. I sat in my office, the soft hum of the fireplace crackling in the background. The scent of cedarwood filled the air, rich and warm, a stark contrast to the icy storm brewing outside. On the screen in front of me, my parents remained huddled at the locked gates. Cold. Soaking wet. Desperate. I could still hear my mother's muffled sobs through the security system, could see my father's shoulders hunched in silent, furious resignation. I watched them for a long time. Long enough for the sky to darken. Long enough for their shivers to become violent tremors. The storm had fully set in now, the wind howling through the trees, sharp pellets of sleet biting at their exposed skin. They weren't leaving. Not because they didn't want to, but because they had nowhere to go. Just like I hadn't. I leaned back in my chair, fingers steepled under my chin. I had won. I had taken everything from them, just as they had taken everything from me. And yet, something inside me was still unsettled. A cold, hollow place in my chest that victory hadn't filled. I had spent years climbing, clawing my way to this moment, dreaming of the day I would get to look down at them the way they had once looked down at me. But now that they were there, shivering, broken, begging, it didn't feel the way I had imagined. It didn't feel like enough. I stood, walking slowly to the grand window that overlooked the estate. The glass was cold beneath my fingertips as I traced an invisible pattern along its surface. Outside, my mother curled in on herself, rocking slightly, her lips moving in frantic whispers I couldn't hear. My father sat stiffly beside her, unmoving, a man too proud to collapse but too weak to stand. I should have felt satisfaction, triumph. But instead, all I felt was tired. The exhaustion was sudden, creeping up my spine, settling deep in my bones. I had spent my entire life chasing this. Chasing them. But now that I had them, now that they were nothing but ruined figures outside my gates, I realized. They weren't the giants I had built them up to be in my mind. They weren't gods. They weren't even villains. They were just people. Weak. Fragile. Pathetic. And suddenly, I didn't care about them anymore. I turned away from the window, exhaling slowly. They weren't worth it. Not my anger. Not my hatred. Not even my revenge. They were already dead inside, already lost. And I wasn't like them. I refused to be. I walked back to my desk, pressing the intercom button one last time. My mother flinched at the sound, her swollen eyes snapping to the camera. My father, however, simply sat still, his head bowed in defeat. I let the silence stretch, let them feel the weight of it. Then, finally, I spoke. "You're not my family." My mother let out a broken sob. "Please." "I don't hate you," I continued, my voice smooth, steady. "You're not important enough for that." She clutched her chest as if I had stabbed her. I didn't care. "I'm done with you," I said, my tone final. This is the last time you'll ever hear my voice." I watched as panic bled into her features, watched as her mouth opened and closed, desperate to say something, anything that might change my mind. But I was already pressing the next button. And just like that, the screen went black. The connection cut. And for the first time in years, I was truly free. I left the office without looking back, walking through the quiet halls of my home. I didn't need to check the cameras again. I didn't need to listen for their cries. They were nothing to me now. Ghosts of a past I had finally put to rest. By the time I reached the balcony overlooking the courtyard, the snow had begun to fall in thick, heavy flakes. I stepped outside, letting the cold air bite at my skin, letting the silence of the night settle over me. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of a life I had long since abandoned. I closed my eyes, breathed in, breathed out. For the first time in forever, I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't surviving. I wasn't fighting. I was simply existing. And it was enough. I turned, walking back into the warmth of my home, the doors closing behind me with a soft click. Outside, the snow covered everything, burying the past, erasing the footprints, leaving nothing but silence behind. And I never looked back.